Hi students, we're talking about American expansion this week. I talked about settlement in the Midwest. We talked about some of the consequences of expansion with currency, wars against the Native American peoples, and now we're going to turn to American expansion outside North America. And this is the beginning of the story of the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century. And the United States journey that we've seen begin with colonies seeking to become independent, states seeking to become a united nation, and now the nation becoming a global superpower and becoming even an empire. Now, as an empire, the United States was slow compared to the rest of the Western world. We know that Spain and Portugal and Britain and France have been developing empires across the world for a number of centuries by 1900. But we also see that the pace of imperialism picks up as we get into the second half of the 19th century. And this is a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. It means that it's now extremely difficult, if not impossible, for non-industrialized nations in Asia and Africa, where colonization had not taken place, to resist Western armies. And it means that there is a greater demand for raw materials in these Western countries, raw materials that they can gain access to in Africa and in Asia. And there is a concern in the United States that the United States might fall behind. Now, some might say that the United States has already created its empire with huge natural resources and raw materials in the Midwest and in the Rockies in the late 19th century. But the difference is that these regions have been integrated into the United States as equal states within this nation, not as colonies. And we're going to see this trend continue, but only up to a point. And so we start to see American expansion. There is a growing body of thought within the United States that in order to continue to be successful, the United States needs more lands with access to raw materials and a bigger navy to defend them. And we start to see American expansion begin in the Pacific, the purchase of Alaska from the Russians shortly after the Civil War, done mainly for strategic reasons in order to exclude another potential rival from the North American continent. But it turns out to be basically the best bargain since the Louisiana Purchase because of the huge resources of oil and gold that will be discovered in Alaska. Samoa also allows the United States to establish a naval base there in exchange for access to trade with the United States, and this happens in the 1870s. So now you have a situation where the United States has military influence in a region or in a place that is not a member of the nation. So is this the point where the United States starts to become an empire? We also have, among the growth of American influence in the Pacific, the islands of Hawaii, which had been a monarchy, united monarchy, for about 100 years. And in 1891, there's an agreement made that Hawaii will not allow rivals, political rivals of the United States, like Russia and Britain, to access or use their islands, and in return, they will have tariff-free access to the United States. So again, is this a type of imperialism? What happens next certainly is American planters become more and more influential in the islands of Hawaii, and when the Queen of Hawaii tries to curb their influence, they call in the US Marines, they have the monarchy overthrown, they petition the United States for annexation. The president at the time, who was Grover Cleveland, says that this was an unjust uprising and refuses to accept the annexation, but the next president, President McKinley, does accept the annexation of Hawaii. And so we see American influence growing in the Pacific. We see American influence grow again in what's known as the Spanish-American War in 1898. And so here we kind of see two empires pass each other. This marks the humiliating end of the great Spanish Empire that had spanned basically the whole of the Americas, at least Central and Southern America, had been founded by Christopher Columbus, but had been in decline now for about 150 years. And the rise of this new power, the United States. And it's based around the island of Cuba. Cuba, one of the oldest Spanish colonies, and one of the areas in Latin America still controlled by the Spanish. There is the latest in a series of Cuban revolts against the Spanish. And the Spanish even offer the Cubans autonomy as long as they'll remain a colony. So basically you can govern yourselves, but you still have to be a colony of Spain. But at the same time, the Americans, who have American planters, again, who have sugar interests in Cuba, are agitating for the United States to get involved in this war. There's this idea of freeing the Cubans from the imperial tyranny of the Spanish. And President McKinley doesn't want to go to war. The Spanish monarchy doesn't want to go to war either. But the media pressure is such that it becomes very difficult. And the media starts leaking diplomatic information, showing or suggesting that the Spanish think the Americans are weak. And so there's this pressure to go to war, and we see the rise in the importance of the media in driving and shaping American political life for the first time. People are going to die as a result of this. Then the USS Maine, one of the battleships of the United States, docks in Havana, Cuba, just for a routine visit, although you might wonder what is it doing there in the first place, especially at this time, and is blown up. Still to this day, we don't know who did it. But at this point, the pressure is overwhelming, and the United States needs to go to war. When the war begins, it's over in 114 days, and the United States convincingly defeats the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Manila Bay, takes control of the Philippines. In Cuba, the fighting is more difficult on land. It is famous, this particular campaign, for future President Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, a group of former cowboys, Irish policemen, former Native American warriors who gain reputations as national heroes fighting in this war. But eventually, it's naval power that enables the United States to complete the defeat of Spain, which is agreed at the Treaty of Paris, yet another Treaty of Paris, in 1898. By the terms of this treaty, Cuba is granted its independence, something that the United States honors, but with restrictions. Cuba can't make alliances with any other nations. There are budgetary restrictions on how Cuban revenue can be spent, and that the United States is permitted to hold bases and on the shore of Cuba, one of which remains today is Guantanamo Bay. So Cuba will remain independent with these restrictions. The islands of Puerto Rico and Guam become territories of the United States. So they have the privileges of being, the inhabitants have the privilege of being citizens without voting for the federal government. This marks the end of the Spanish Empire, the rise of the American Empire, and the continued expression of the idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny combined with social Darwinism. Social Darwinism that we saw in the rise of industry and big business in the 19th century, that said that human beings are on a path to progress that's achieved through struggle. Only the fittest can survive. By dominating other people, the fittest, the most efficient, the strongest are advancing the human race. The United States begins to see wars like the Spanish-American War as doing the same thing, the elimination of weaker rival powers. And we see this certain condescension in the approach to the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. The Philippines, which significantly and by design had been left out of the terms of the agreement of the Treaty of Paris, which the United States wanted to control. And so they refuse to allow the Philippines to govern themselves, and the Filipinos resist, and this leads to a far more brutal war than the Spanish-American War, in which the United States spends $600 million, in which 200,000 Filipinos are killed, often in brutal massacres that were carried out by American troops in order to suppress resistance to their takeover of the islands. And so here again, we see this idea of manifest destiny and social Darwinism now being applied outside North America as American influence grows in the world. And this control of the Philippines is going to enable the United States to increase its control and influence in China and the great trading opportunities that are increasingly available in China. China by the 19th century, by the late 19th century, has become very weak because it is not industrialized in the way that Western nations have. And so we see that Western nations are carving out their own enclaves within China, where although they're not taking over China, the Chinese are unable to police them, that are being ruled by British laws or French laws or Dutch laws. And the United States joins in this semi-colonization with what's called the open door policy. The United States will resist any efforts to of one particular European country to colonize China, but basically they're fine as long as everyone else is getting a share in the pie. So once again, we see American influence growing and expanding outside of North America.